Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition has a lot of rules, some arguably more important than others. The game, however, was largely designed around the notion that the rules don't need to strictly be adhered to, but rather that they can be used as guidelines to help structure your game and that they can be altered or removed entirely in order to better support the type of game that you're trying to facilitate. However, despite this, there are actually 3 rules that the designers heavily caution against changing in any way, and they are listed in Chapter 9 of the Dungeon Master's Guide. And those are rules relating to action economy, rules relating to attunement for magic items, and rules relating to concentration. Concentration is considered so fundamental and critical to the design of 5th edition that you're strongly recommended to not touch it. They stress that changing any of these rules can result in a game that is seriously overcomplicated or unbalanced, and honestly, I can see how they ended up at that conclusion. But concentration, I think, is a bit more complicated than that, so let's talk about it. A quick heads up, I'm about to say the word concentration a ridiculous amount of times. Make a guess in the comments and let me know if you got it right. The answer will be at the end. My quest also continues to reach 10,000 subscribers before the 2024 PHB comes out in September, so if you like what I do, a sub to the channel would really mean a lot. Before we can talk about the impacts that the concentration mechanic has had on the game as a whole, I think it's important that we first talk about what it is and why it exists in 5e in the first place. It's often said that concentration was brought into D&D with 5th edition, and this technically isn't true. You can see traces of it all the way back to AD&D 1st edition, but the mechanics of it were really not defined. It was more of a descriptive element of spells or certain features rather than some kind of mechanical requirement. Things like the Spiritual Hammer spell in AD&D 1e says, as long as the cleric who invoked it concentrates upon the hammer, it will strike any opponent within range as desired by the cleric. We can see from this that the idea of concentration in D&D isn't exactly a new concept, but its definition and implementation in the game has dramatically changed over the editions. In 1st and 2nd edition, it was mostly the same. It largely existed as an ambiguous concept that left a lot up to the players or the Dungeon Master to determine the importance of, or how it manifested itself in the game. In 3rd edition though, it became a lot more defined, like most things did in this era. A concentration check could be made whenever something would happen that could potentially distract you from what you were doing. It's worth noting that this is not exclusive to spellcasting, but could be required for other types of abilities too, like picking locks. If the check succeeds, you continue doing whatever you were doing. If the check fails and you were making it to continue casting a spell, the spell drops and it becomes wasted. The player's handbook provided some suggestions for the types of distractions and their related DCs that you would need to make in order to maintain concentration. For example, taking damage, just like in 5e, could result in losing concentration, though the DC is 10 plus the level of the spell plus the damage taken. Things like vigorous motion while riding on a mount could also impact the DC. Becoming grappled or pinned are also all examples of things that could make you lose your concentration. What's interesting here is that, as mentioned earlier, this isn't exclusive to spellcasting. The check can be made for any type of ongoing action that may require additional focus. This is an interesting design element, but probably also resulted in one that was a bit on the overbearing side. A decision was made to trade ease of use for some additional semblance of realism here. It's also worth noting that, by my understanding at least, there was no rule preventing spell stacking in 3rd edition, which undoubtedly led to some insane wombo combos and almost certainly contributed to the version of concentration that we have today in 5th edition. 4th edition, well, like basically most things 4e did, it dropped basically any notion of concentration from the game. It did, however, introduce a similar but different mechanic known as sustain, which is something that we will get to a little bit later on. Now that we've established some of the context, we arrive at 5th edition. Shout out to all my members, Julian in the Champion tier, Jackal3 and Jumpy Sonic Bear in the Hero tier, Julio, Siren XY, Brain Laborix, Nathan, and D&D Unoptimized in the Warrior tier, and the Martin Sale in the Veteran tier. If you want to help support me for as little as $1 per month and get access to all kinds of some fun rewards, click on the join button. Thanks. Most people probably know how concentration works, but we'll briefly go over it. When you cast a spell that requires concentration, you can still cast any other spell, provided it doesn't also require your concentration. If you do, you immediately drop concentration on the first spell and resume it on the new one. You can continue to take any other actions as you normally would. There are only 2 other ways that you can be forced to drop concentration: if you take damage or if you become incapacitated. If you take damage, you make a Constitution saving throw at DC 10 plus half the damage you took. If you succeed, you maintain your concentration, and if you fail, you drop it. If you become incapacitated, you immediately drop your concentration. One interesting element of the mechanic that I'm sure most people have simply glossed over is the last two lines where it says, the DM might also decide that certain environmental phenomena such as waves crashing over you while on a storm-tossed ship require you to succeed on a DC 10 Constitution saving throw to maintain concentration on a spell. This brings a bit of the 3rd edition version of concentration into 5e, but it leaves it very much up to the DM to determine what characteristics or environmental conditions may warrant the making of a saving throw. This should probably be used a lot more. Now that we know how it works, why does concentration exist in the form that it does in 5e? Ultimately, it comes down to reigning in power and preventing unlimited spell stacking. The 5th edition designers wanted to avoid situations that have existed in the past where spellcasters were functionally able to execute incredible combos all on their own by casting multiple spells in succession, which would allow them to become even more powerful than they already are. Without concentration limits, there's no shortage of things that casters could execute. This mechanic is essentially entirely focused on keeping power at least somewhat restrained. An interesting side effect of this rule is that it can also help encourage teamwork at the table, something the designers have been very open about trying to enable. So it's not so much that these wild combos can't happen, but that in order to make them happen, you need to have another player working with you to coordinate it. Some might like this and others might hate it, but it's clear that the intent is to help prevent one player from simply dominating the battlefield or the session entirely on their own, and allows all players to help contribute to the success of the group. Everything I've talked about so far makes concentration sound like it's nothing but rainbows and butterflies, but the reality is that it isn't. Actually, I guess it's not so much concentration that's the issue, but more its excessive implementation as a safeguard against power. As of right now, in May 2024, there are 524 spells in the game. 233 of them require concentration. That's 44% of the total spell pool. That's a lot. For something that's intended to be used just to prevent certain niche uses from getting a bit too out of hand, it sure is used an awful lot. This immediately raises two fundamental design questions to me. One, is concentration used too much? Was the team simply overcautious and maybe overtagged spells in fear of things becoming broken? Or two, is the average spell power in the game too high, warranting a higher than expected usage of concentration? I think that the answer to both of these questions is yes. Let's talk about each. But before we do, it bears mentioning that there is a narrative element to the mechanic as well. Many spells that require concentration do so because it just makes sense that they would be spells that require your channeling to maintain. This is essentially the in-lore reason for why it exists, but there are definitely some spells that could just as easily have required concentration that don't, like Animate Dead. Sure, you could say that once the creatures have been imbued with the magic that it just lasts for the duration, but it just as easily could have required active channeling like Animate Objects. Even something like Demiplane, it wouldn't be hard to see a world where this requires concentration. The point I'm trying to make is that while the narrative element of the spell is a very important consideration, it's not the answer either. So, is concentration used too much? I think the answer here is a resounding yes. If you've seen any of the videos in my Worst Design Spells series, you would have almost certainly noticed that the vast majority of them require concentration when they absolutely do not need it. Probably the most famous example of this and the easiest to point out is everyone's favorite, True Strike. This ungodly cantrip requires concentration at the expense of your action simply to provide advantage on one attack on your next turn. Now, Jeremy Crawford has gone on record saying that the reason True Strike is designed in this way is that it's because the team heavily overvalued advantage in the early days of the game. They recognized that it was a powerful effect and they wanted to protect it. This is part of why advantage wasn't as easy to come by early on in 5th edition's lifecycle. This certainly is not true today. It's not all that hard to have sources of advantage anymore. What this tells us though goes beyond a lot more than just advantage and disadvantage. It demonstrates that the team was keenly aware of the potential for certain mechanics in the game to be able to be exploited or overused, and in an effort to prevent that, they wanted to ensure that there was a safeguard in place. Enter concentration. I think a great place to highlight the misuse of concentration is with two spells, Guidance and Resistance. Both of these are cantrips. One of them, Guidance, is a famously very good spell, and the other, Resistance, has always been mediocre at best. And while the fact that concentration has been a requirement for both of these has certainly had some impact on their use, it's not a big part of why resistance was so rarely cast. Resistance, specifically, suffered from saving throws being difficult to predict outside of combat, but if you were in combat then yeah, sacrificing your concentration on it was certainly a tall ask. This really then begs the question, why did these spells require concentration in the first place? The answer to this, from a design perspective, is quite clear and is the same for both spells. The team wanted to prevent multiple people from being able to benefit from the spells simultaneously. They didn't simply want the cleric spam casting it on the group all day long, which, since it's a cantrip, they could do. So in order to prevent this, they made the spell require concentration, which then prevents the potential abuse of the spell during gameplay. But remember when I said that guidance and resistance highlight why concentration was overused by the designers? Yeah, that's because in the revised 2024 Player's Handbook, neither guidance or resistance will require it. They've both been redesigned to accomplish the same functional effect, but the concentration requirement has been cut on both. This really underscores that the requirement was just not necessary. Obvious caveat, the 2024 books haven't been released yet, so anything could change, but it seems unlikely that these will, based on how Jeremy Crawford spoke about them during the survey results videos. Both spells have been changed to be instantaneous effect spells that trigger on a reaction which you take in response to an ally within 10 feet of you failing their saving throw or ability check. No more concentration. Furthermore, if something happens and you and your group all simultaneously fall into a trap or something, you only have one reaction to use, so if everyone had the spell on, they can't all benefit from it during the same event. This, in my opinion at least, is a brilliant piece of design and skirts the need for concentration while still arriving at largely the same end result. Is guidance a little bit worse than before? Sure, probably, but I think it makes it much healthier and makes resistance actually usable. Another example of a spell that just doesn't need concentration is something like Flame Arrows. This isn't a cantrip, it's not infinitely repeatable, and it costs your 3rd level spell slot and adds a maximum of 12d8 fire damage assuming that every single one of the arrows hits their target. This spell just doesn't need concentration. Again, it's there because there was clearly a concern that players might be able to stack an insane amount of fire damage through multiple castings of the spell, and to that I'd say, so what? It costs their 3rd level spell slot. That on its own isn't insignificant, but even more, it then requires a subsequent attack roll for each arrow. I'm not even confident that Flame Arrows would see play without concentration, but it might at least be a consideration. Which is kind of the goal when it comes to spell design. Not every spell needs to be a must-have, but most of them should at least be worth thinking about. I'm not going to go into every example here because there are just so many and it would take forever. The point that I'm trying to make though is that the design team used concentration probably a bit too generously out of fear of something being game-breaking. But here's the thing. It feels like they were so comfortable with it being their great equalizer that it ends up being used on powerful spells to say that they've been toned down, but it doesn't actually change all that much. Take Hypnotic Pattern. This is an insanely powerful spell, but it's got concentration. Okay, if everyone's knocked out by it, that probably doesn't matter all that much since you're very unlikely to be taking damage to end up dropping it, but even if you don't and say someone resists, you can be 120 feet away behind the rest of your party. Sure, concentration prevents you from comboing something like Bane with it on your own, but it's not doing all that much else. No, I don't think that they should drop concentration from Hypnotic Pattern, that's not what I'm getting at. What I am getting at is that this speaks to point number 2 from earlier, which is the average spell power in the game too high, causing concentration to be required at a higher than expected rate? Yes, Hypnotic Pattern is an exceptionally powerful spell already, and removing concentration would only make it more powerful. But there is a much larger trend at play here, where the designers likely leaned a bit too much on concentration and expected it to do a lot more of the heavy lifting than it was capable of doing. It's not that concentration is necessarily bad or broken, it's that the times where it is used are often questionable and don't quite hit the design goal. Another element worth mentioning is that some classes are just overburdened with concentration spells in comparison to others. 30 of Paladin's 50 spells require it, 32 of Ranger's 60, and 79 of Druid's 157. When half or more of a class's spells require concentration, that's just too much. It bogs the class down and makes them feel like their spellcasting is a lot more cumbersome than it actually needs to be. And for something like a Paladin, it reinforces the positive feedback loop of why burn a spell slot for a mediocre concentration spell when I can just smite. And for rangers, it similarly makes it even harder to justify something that isn't Hunter's Mark. Yes, of course, there will be scenarios worth it to not use Hunter's Mark or Smite and to use a spell slot for something else, but this just doesn't help with that. So to take a shot at the second question, is the average spell level too high? The answer is still a yes. If anything, the use of the concentration mechanic as an equalizer has likely only exacerbated this gap. If we use our examples from before, adding concentration to Hypnotic Pattern didn't even make the spell weaker in a direct sense, it just made combos harder. But adding it to Flame Arrows made the spell mostly unplayable. What this does is make bad spells look even worse, and makes the gap between the good and the bad spells much wider, leading to a world where there are probably fewer middle-of-the-road spells than there actually should be. One other thing worth mentioning is something I've sarcastically dubbed Super Concentration in my Worst Design Spells videos. This is something that appears on a few spells in the game, and turns what can be an otherwise interesting effect, and renders it nearly unusable. You can find this so-called super concentration on Witch Bolt, Crown of Madness, and Enervation. Essentially, not only do all three of these spells require you to maintain your concentration on them as usual, but they also require the caster to use their action on each of their turns in order to maintain the spell. This is significantly more onerous than the normal rules, but does kind of make me wonder, should this just be how it works? Obviously, it would be a significant nerf to casters, but it may help with the ever-present martial-caster divide. If when you cast Hypnotic Pattern, you had to spend each of your subsequent turns maintaining the spell with your action, that would be a lot more restrictive on the caster and create a much more meaningful decision point. Do I want to give up my next few turns in favor of this battlefield control spell, or do I want to do something else? To be clear, I'm not necessarily advocating for this, I'm just posing this as a question. Nothing like this will happen in the 2024 books, I think we can all be sure of that though. This concept though isn't dissimilar to the idea of sustaining spells, which came about in 4th edition like I alluded to earlier. Sustain is kind of the bridge that existed between the concentration checks of 3rd edition and concentration as a mechanic that we know today in 5th edition. Also, I'm not an expert on 4E, I'm not even going to pretend that I am, so if someone else can't provide additional details or context in the comments, I'm totally here for it. Anyway, essentially, certain abilities in 4th edition allowed you to sustain them. As long as you took the required action, either a sustain minor, move, or standard action, you could keep the effect going on your turn and something would happen. Either you could just keep the effect going, or you could stack additional creatures or move the effect somewhere else. This could be another interesting way of handling concentration. Have it require an action or bonus action or reaction to even sustain the effect, but then give additional abilities that may or may not trigger based on that. In some capacity, you can see elements of sustain in the quote-unquote super concentration spells mentioned earlier, so maybe it should be implemented more actually. One final thing to consider is the potential expansion of concentration outside of spell effects. This, to some extent at least, has already happened as there are a number of magic items in the game that have effects that require you to concentrate on them as if you were concentrating on a spell. Things like the Ring of Jinni Summoning, or the Spell Shard, or the Flying Citadel Helm, and the Ring of Shooting Stars all require the wearer to do this. Perhaps if more items required this, or if certain features required it, then the amount of spells requiring it could be lessened, or their impacts, like with Hypnotic Pattern, might be able to be better felt. This would take some very careful balancing though, as I think it would be important to not overdo it and get to a point where half of the things in the game just require concentration, which would obviously just be obnoxious. Overall, I like the mechanic. I think it's an interesting and probably necessary thing to have in the game, at least with its current format. It helps rein in power and can prevent things from getting out of hand very quickly or from one player just dominating a game. So what's the answer to all this then? I don't think that there's an easy one, but I do sincerely hope that with the 2024 books coming out in just a few months, that the design team has taken a very hard look at all the spells in the game, and particularly those that require concentration, to make sure the mechanic is actually doing its job. And if you were keeping score, I said concentration 73 times, including that one. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. Let me know what you think about it in the comments. Check out some of my other D&D videos, but otherwise, take care.